Hey everybody, thank you for stopping by, and thank you Dr. Ebert for allowing me to do this extra credit project. And honestly, for being enthusiastic about wanting me to share this with everybody, which I thought was super cool, and I'm happy to do it. It was very fun to do, and it was really interesting. So we're trying to apply experimental archaeology to reconstruct, as best we can, the hand-to-hand combat of Mesoamerican warriors. And this all came about in lecture when we talked about warfare, and we highlighted some iconic weapons like the Macuahuitl. We might remember that as the wooden club with obsidian blades attached to it. And I was thinking, how would they have used those in fighting? So a little bit of background on that. I'm a part-time fencing instructor for a historical European swordplay club here in Pittsburgh. For those curious, the organization is the Steel City Historical Fencing. And I knew for a fact that a couple of our members had Macuahuitl trainers. And you'll see them in the video, but I have one on loan here that I'll go ahead and I'll share. And you'll notice that it's not obsidian and wood, and we couldn't obviously do that for safety reasons. This is like a high-density modern plastic, and it was perfect for our purposes. We wanted to focus on that particular weapon to keep it simple. We could have added spears and stuff like that, but just to keep it simple, we focused on kind of the Mesoamerican fencing. If you want to consider this like a sword, like the swordsmanship of Mesoamerican warriors. And by nature of us being a historical European group, or a swordsmanship group, we had access to trainers that the early colonial troops also would have had, the types of swords that they would have had, and you'll see, and we compared them together, and that was fascinating in and of itself. So, that said, most of us also have a lot of training and specialization in historical European swordplay, so that might have affected the experimentation as well, just as a note. So the hypotheses we went into these experiments with were kind of ones I wanted our team to focus on, so that we weren't just senselessly beating each other up. But it's also useful for us in this presentation to know what to look for in these clips. So the first one is we're trying to wound the opponent, not outright kill them. We're aiming for the arms and legs. When we talked about Tsompantlis and skull racks, to me, we're trying to avoid the head to keep it intact as best we could. We're working on grips. So you'll notice that the grip here is kind of long. In warrior iconography, they're holding these things in various different positions, and we're playing with that. In lecture, Dr. Ebert mentioned that because this weapon is kind of blunt, it's not really a piercing weapon, so they might have not thrusted with them. They were only probably swinging, cutting, and chopping with them. We experimented with that as well. We had a very interesting reflection on that, which you'll see. And then finally, we weren't able to integrate this one, which is too bad, but it was a really kind of overly ambitious sort of experiment, hypothesis type of thing. And that was the relationship with warfare and the ball game that we've been talking about. Was the ball game like cross-training for warriors? Did it help condition them for war? Were there like team tactics maybe that we could extrapolate from the ball game reconstruction? Interesting to note nonetheless, but we weren't able to do it. So, final thing to note before we go into it, we didn't have time to do the jaguar uniform and the elaborate feather headdresses. We just had our safety gear, as you'll see. And we operated like, okay, it was a one hit, a kill, and we reset. In reality, they probably would have just kept going with those kind of hits you'll see, and for the most part anyway, until one or honestly both fighters couldn't continue. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and roll the clips. Thank you, and I really do hope you enjoy.
So right here, from right to left, we've got JJ, we've got Cody, and we've got Connor, and they're all members of the local club. So guys, playing with these weapons, what are your thoughts on this compared to like our typical European studies?
It's hefty. So when I was fighting with this, I was trying different grips, as Nick mentioned in the intro video, and what I found most effective was holding it closer to the end, which gives you an extra couple inches of reach, and letting just the momentum of the weapon do the work for me. So it gives you the extra reach to go down for a leg or reach in for an arm from just a little bit further away. Especially since I had the smaller shield and Nick had the bigger shield, I'd be real careful to watch my distance. Fighting with the European side sword, I would not want to fight an Aztec warrior using this.
As a caveat, like we talked about in class, Connor over here brings up a good point. We want to try to we're a little bit more conscious of the materiality of the weapon. Like we don't want to bash it too hard, right? Because you could break all the obsidian blades and it basically becomes a club. That said, I can imagine that still being an effective weapon. But it should be noted, like we talked about in class, obsidian was it was very common. So they had merchants that were specialists in just knocking that stuff out. So that stuff, you just go to your local merchant and be like, hey, I need some obsidian blades. So I'm sure for the military, they would have had a stockpile of that stuff ready in the eventuality that blades are going to break. And I've noticed, from my experience, I noticed in the fighting all of you, the blades, incidental things happen. So I could imagine these things after a battle would need to be refitted.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
So these
Yes.
are obviously blunt. And just saying, even getting hit with these blunt ones hurts.
About possibly doing kind of slaps with the side of it.
Oh, yeah,
and it
yeah.
might not affecting the obsidian, but again, I'm not so sure how well it was secured in, or maybe they used adhesives with it as well to keep it a little extra.
That's something we didn't talk about in class. That's an interesting point. And you do bring up a good point. In the sparring footage, we'll notice that we're all actively trying not to meet edge on edge, just to preserve the obsidian blades and be conscious of the material. Yeah, we're not trying to do that. Instead, we're trying to kind of rebat each other. We're thinking that using the side, using it kind of in a paddle-like motion, in a paddle-like defensive motion, that's probably going to be our best bet. However, that is a lot easier said than done.
Much easier said than done.
So the shield is our friend in that regard.
And then we also brought up about the fact that in here it would have feathers or something like that.
Yeah.
What the purpose of that might be.
So yeah, that might be a thing, and that's something to note. So we only had one big round shield, like we alluded to before, and what we saw in the codices, we'd have feathers hanging down from the bottom. It was kind of an observation I made. I think it was interesting that a lot of our shots were trying to go to the legs, and this makes sense. If we're trying to capture enemies to bring back and ritualistically sacrifice and all that, wounding the legs make a whole lot of sense. When we were aiming for the legs, a lot of us were avoiding the legs to avoid getting those hit. It's interesting to note that if there are feathers down there, I still think this is kind of an interesting thought experiment. Those might be there not just for a rank distinguisher, but also it could be for a psychological factor. It could kind of trip up your vision and your perception trying to get somebody's legs, I think. Now, stabbing with these weapons, it was mentioned in lecture that they probably wouldn't stab them because, as you can see with the facsimiles here, they're kind of flat. There's no obsidian blade up there.
The only thing I can think of is, say, if I'm kind of maybe if I overswing and my opponent is coming in, and I kind of do something to kind of create distance or something like that, just kind of a prod.
Or even,
I don't know how useful it would be as.
I feel like thrusting to most parts of the body is probably not going to do anything.
I mean,
but
it
if
hurts.
you get a good jab just to the face or the eyes, something just to create just a couple seconds where the opponent's stunned and you can bring it around
and yeah, but as a fatal, just method in itself, I can see it as a setup.
Yeah, that's it.
So.
And that's something I was trying to do as well. I was using it as a prod from your defenses because we were using shields. I was trying to kind of open you up and distract you, and I wasn't aiming. Connor there did bring up a good point, aiming at the face, because I can see that being psychologically disconcerting, but as well, if it does connect with somebody's face, that's still gonna hurt. So.
Pack a pretty good punch, especially when you get caught in the.
I am so sorry. FYI, everybody, these things make great spanking paddles. Unfortunately, we discovered that the hard way.
That's a paddle. I mean, any strike to the head is going to set you back in a fight, enough to open you up for another strike somewhere else. Very few times I think you'd take a shot to the face and not just, not have it affect the rest of your fighting.
I mean, especially if it's a hard enough hit, you're probably done for the fight.
Yeah.
You might not be dead, but you're not putting up a fight.
So what I found was when I went to the sparring, I wasn't trying to go for head strikes because obviously we want sacrifices for later. But when I ended up going for the head was when I had no other option and it was a quick smack to the head. So that might be something to think about where they're not full power cleaving strikes coming down. They're attacks that you can get because they're there, and then you can go for something else.
And even if it's not enough to get into the skull, to cut the skull, just if you've ever seen anybody get a cut on their forehead, it bleeds a lot. So you will have just blood running into your face. It will be, and then just, once you're bleeding, like your mind just starts going elsewhere. Like it's very, it's not good. You'll get disoriented, things like that. So.
And all you need is one good second. If you're just discombobulated for just that little piece of time,
That's all you need.
Just a second strike and then you're done.
Yeah, I bring that up just because in a lot of the codices we mentioned, or that were referenced in class, a lot of the dismemberments that were depicted. Granted, these were already captured people, so they were just restrained and whatever, but a lot of the wounds that we talked about in class were to the limbs, so to the legs and arms and stuff like that. And we had a lot of talk about the heads being reserved for ritual, right? So I thought it was interesting. The head was really open a lot, and a lot of those hits, I totally agree with all of you, a lot of those hits would have been martially valid. Absolutely. So I mean, I don't know. That's an interesting question in and of itself. I was going, personally, again, I bring this up because in bringing it up in class, I was going into these sets of experiments thinking the head was just not a target. We wanted to stay away from it. But it seemed like, if it was an opportune target, that's what we go for.
And if it's, hitting someone in the head, killing them, versus you getting cut yourself or stabbed, there's going to be more people that you can bring in for sacrifices somewhere else. So, yeah.
I mean, I think what we've all kind of just noticed from fencing in general is an open target's an open target.
Yeah.
Just if it's to the hands, I'll take it. If it's to the shoulder, I'll take it. To the head, I'll take it. Just whatever your opponent has open, you can work them down with consecutive strikes.
We also have to take into context, we were doing a one-on-one situation.
Yeah.
For the most part, at this moment. If we had a little bit more time to do the melee, because I wanted to do a melee to see how this worked.
It'd be rough.
It would be different. Well, because it's like, then there's more factors to go in there. But one-on-one, it's definitely a different thing. So you notice that this particular sword, it's an evolution of kind of the medieval standard sword. It's got a couple of rings, it's got a knuckle guard, it's a little bit more advanced. This is kind of something we probably would have seen of that 16th century golden age when the colonials were coming when the Spanish and so on were coming to the Americas. This is probably the common weapon you would have seen.
But anyway, so at first I had using it in conjunction with the small shield, the buckler, and this worked out okay because I could block strikes from his attacks. So block and I could go in for stabs. When I lost this, or if maybe I wasn't carrying one that day and I got into battle, it became a lot worse for me because this has a pretty decent further range than that weapon, but I can't block. If he swung and it made contact with my blade, I got batted out of the way, and then I was open for attack. So if you watch some of the exchanges where he rushes in at me, I almost always lose. As soon as he closes that distance and I can't get a stab in, I lose.
It looked like the distance was at your advantage, though. Like you got some clean thrusts in just by little effort.
That was my main strategy, was just keeping that distance and just stabbing. But like I said, if If he rushes in, that's when he gained the advantage, and the match is usually went to him.
So just for everybody's information, the buckler, that's a small shield. That right there is a training facsimile. And we have an example right there. JJ was kind of showing as well. He's got kind of a cool looking one. But like, that would have been this combination of what they call a side sword. So that's what that European sword is, or the kind of nomenclature most folks use. The side sword and the buckler would have been kind of a common combination. That totally would have been in the realm of believability for a colonial soldier. So Connor, you were fighting against that using kind of the bigger shield, which was a little bit closer to what looks like the Aztec shield and the Macuahuitl. How did you feel using that against the Spanish weaponry?
Well, it was a little more interesting. I'm not used to those bigger round shields. I'm used to something more like a buckler.
Sure.
So for me, with the round shield, it's probably due to more of my inexperience using it, where it felt a lot harder to kind of, I wanted to reach out more with the shield.
Sure.
I wanted to pretty much try and goad him into a thrust, try and push tip aside with my shield, and then just close in and kill him or wound him.
Sure.
But yeah, it was kind of hard to block all the thrusts, and occasionally, as you saw, I'd get stabbed.
It's a unique kind of skill set. That's very fair. How did you feel about the Macuahuitl, the sword club? I guess you could call it there. How did you feel using that compared to the European stuff?
Compared to the European stuff, because of what this would have been made of, there was definitely like I can't really throw this out that much, or I felt like I couldn't throw it out as much to just bat at his blade, due to the brittle material this would have been made out of. Whereas with European swords and stuff like sabers, military sabers, it's just nice to just bat it all day and get in some kind of opening in. With this, it's like you gotta be a lot more careful, gotta go for arms or legs.
All right, so we just did the multi-man fight with these to see what that would have been like, okay? So I've got thoughts on it. I know my pal Connor and my pal JJ have thoughts on it as well. So if you guys want a really quick have a rundown on what you thought about using these both by themselves and with the shields when we're fighting multiple people.
Sure. So we were doing a mix, either using this two-handed or using it with a shield. Definitely feels better with a buckler or the bigger round shield. But even with two hands, it's like, it's dangerous because you have absolutely nothing to really protect you from any strike other than completely getting out of the way. But I did kind of like trying to just throw out these long-armed cuts either to the legs or to the hands or to the arms. That seemed kind of nice. But
You had some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I noticed the same thing where with the two-hand, it gives you extra extension and with your strike when you switch to your offhand. Another thing that I tried in one of the exchanges was just kind of coming into a parry, and then coming into a grapple from there, which is something that you see in historical European martial arts.
You do, and what's interesting about that too, we got to keep in mind the context here. We're trying to capture prisoners to bring back to the city, right? So that, what you were doing, so if you want to like replicate that with me, so you're going in, and then I'm all, and then I'm all tangled up. Granted, we could probably start grappling here, but if you're a really good grappler, like I know you in particular are, like then this is going to really be bad news bears for me, right? And then he's got me at his mercy. He could throw that handle at me, and obviously he's got this big baseball bat. So what did we think? Oh, I'm sorry, go on.
and especially with, you mentioned the numbers.
Yeah.
You know, if there's someone grappling another person, you have a friend, that buddy of yours can just come from behind, leg hit, arm hit, anything. And really, if you're that single person, you've got to kind of try and get the first person wounded ASAP so you can make it a fair fight. But
You see
the longer that fight goes, it's like if you got 2-on-1, you're just kind of living on borrowed time.
How did we feel about these weapons? By themselves, with a shield, how do we feel about them fighting off multiple people versus working with someone? Does this feel like this would be like, ooh, I'm by myself, I have a desperate last stand? Does this feel like an ideal kind of weapon? Does it have a challenge to it? Does it have merits, demerits? From your opinion,
I mean,
or do you feel like it's a better teamwork weapon? Or tool, I should say.
I think it would mainly come down to training and how familiarity with the weapon. I mean, if this was a real one and I was able to, see it chop into meat and I'm confident in what its abilities are, it would dictate how I fight with it, for sure, and what I'd be confident in, what kind of situation I'm getting into with it.
And these weapons they would have known. These were their known weapons, so they would have had a familiarity with it. So as far as confidence is concerned, you would probably, from that logic, probably conclude that these guys were really confident with these things.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure. It's very different than everything that you see in European martial arts.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a really good
More restrictions kind of feels like.
Yeah, so it's really hard to say.
Yeah.
And I think that goes into, like you saying, like, we're not used to stuff like these. They would be, so for all we know, they could be really, like, very comfortable using it for anything.
Yeah, if that's all
Anything.
you know, and you're trained from a small child using these things, then, that's going to change your perspective on what your capabilities are with it.
And
That's a really good point.
You're going to know the extent you can take this before it's, it's garbage and you got to drop it for the rest of the fight or something.
So having said that, having kind of come to that conclusion, do you feel like it is a versatile weapon?
Yeah.
From that perspective, like you've trained with it your whole life, this is part of your world, or this is part of your martial world, right? Like, do you feel like, oh yeah, this is pretty versatile?
Yeah, I mean, if you're trained on something, that's what mainly comes into play. Like you can become good with anything, to be honest.
And with the, if you're trying not to kill your opponent, I would, like JJ said, probably take a spear over anything. But if that's my purpose, is I'm trying to just kill off anyone. But if I am trying to get prisoners, I imagine, you'd use this over something like a spear. Once you can get a good saw on an arm or a leg, and it's going to be excruciating, and it's going to be debilitating. It's going to be a lot easier.
Well, if you just look at one of these two, or you see what the actual ones look like, they look intimidating. They look very mean. I mean, just seeing somebody come at you with one of these, it's got to have a psychological effect.
Yeah, and there are YouTube videos out there, of course, of people like recreating these and experimenting on them with like meat.
Yeah,
Sides of meat stuff. And it's
I've
all
seen
like,
some
oh
of those,
geez.
so I don't want to be on the receiving end of that.
No.
So somebody coming at you with one of these, that's kind of. I don't know if I want to stick around too long, or it comes down to numbers in a lot of it too, like what you're saying, and the Aztecs had numbers, right?
Yeah, and numbers. You guys touched on a really good point. So we see on a lot of monuments, and we talked about this in class, of a lot of like warriors being commemorated and stuff like that. Do you guys feel like this, taking on enemies with this, do you think this would be like a machismo thing?
Oh, sure.
Like this would be like, oh man, you're getting a monument.
Yeah, and I mean, it almost sounds like that's kind of like almost half of the whole ensemble.
Yeah.
And if you have someone decked out with these brilliant feathers and maybe something extravagant on the end of this.
One thing that I could definitely see this having very similar to a sword is it is a weapon of war and it is not a tool for anything else really.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to be using this to just, cut trees or something like that. This is a weapon of war.